right now, which means I can post the tweet that we are officially live, and we are. Excellent.
And there's a tweet. Okay.
And there's a tweet. All right. Hello and welcome to the PHP Roundtable podcast. This is the PHP podcast where everyone chimes in. We're just a bunch of random developers discussing ideas about web development. But not all the people at the roundtable are specifically PHP developers, and that's a good thing because different languages and communities tackle problems very differently. And the ultimate goal of the roundtable is to learn from each other. We just have one rule. We will not assume anyone listening to the podcast is an expert in PHP, and therefore we aren't allowed to just drag and drop without explaining ourselves, at least enough to just have some keywords to Google later. So if you're listening live, feel free to ask questions via Twitter and tag PHP Roundtable, and we'll get to your questions hopefully on the show live. Today's topic is functional programming in PHP, which is a fairly advanced topic. So don't worry, because not all topics that we're going to discuss in the PHP Roundtable are going to be this advanced. But if you're new to PHP programming, hang in there. These concepts and keywords are good to have in your head as you grow as a developer. But I actually barely understand this stuff myself, which is why we've got an awesome panel of people who know what they're talking about on the roundtable today, including Jeremy Mikkola. He's the core contributor to the MongoDB PHP
Sorry,
driver.
I just reminded you how to pronounce my last name. You can take that back, sir.
I'm sorry, Mikkola. The accent is on the O. See, I actually wrote out this little pronunciation key, and I still screwed it up.
Okay.
And I have a bachelor's degree in linguistics, which didn't help me at all. So, Jeremy Mikkola, core contributor to the MongoDB PHP driver. He gives many talks at many conferences, and he's the guy behind the impromptu PHP conference WorstCon in Chicago, which is coming up in September. Actually, it's coming up in a few weeks, right?
2 weeks.
In 2 weeks. And that is, what can we expect at WorstCon this year?
There's going to be puns. There's going to be quite a lot of puns. Definitely some sausage, some road trips. Maybe we'll get Phil Sturgeon a job. So should be very exciting. I like to think it's going to be the best and the worst of Chicago in one wonderful weekend.
Oh, it sounds like a lovely time. And that's actually going to be close to where me and Kyle are. Kyle's also at the table. And you're also drinking a Sculpin beer.
Yes, I am. I just tonight learned why Sculpin has a fish logo.
The Sculpin that you're talking about, the
static site. Yes, the static site generator.
Yes.
From Bo Simonson, who I will be seeing this week at Mallison PHP.
Ah, yes. Sweet. And he's actually, I think he's going to be at WorstCon.
Yes, he was thinking of taking it off because he had to do a run on Sunday, but I cajoled him into coming down on Saturday. It's only an hour drive for him, so we have
nice.
like 14 hours from New York. So
sweet. Well, okay. Well, also at the table we have Chris Bowden, who is React PHP core developer. He's the author of Ratchet, and also an avid squash player. Welcome.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on board, man. So what you squash a lot?
He squashes bugs.
Create them, squash them, whatever, same thing. No, squash is a racket sport, and that's what I do to unwind and get out of the computer chair.
So when you're done ratcheting, you racket.
That's right.
Nice. And also at the table we have Mr. Glenn Hinkle, who is the core developer to Modulicious, or a core contributor to Modulicious, which is a Perl programming language that doesn't sound good at all. A web framework for the Perl programming language. Let's say that. And I unmuted him, and I can't unmute him. He's in his car. Are you able to unmute yourself? I actually muted you, buddy. He's flying in from Arizona, and he's in his car joining us for this. He's poking at the screen right now, and he just said, "I'll screw it" with his hand. So I'm not really sure how to unmute him. Hold on. Oh, there he goes.
All right, there we go.
Yay, welcome. So you just got back from Desert City Swing in Phoenix, Arizona, because you were competing in West Coast Swing, which is one of my favorite dances, actually my favorite dance in the whole world. How did you do? Did you compete in anything, Jack and Jills?
I didn't compete. I just critiqued and mocked everyone else. I won at critiquing and mocking everyone. I'm really good at that.
So after you're done mocking everything for your test, you go and you compete and mock everybody at the dance competition.
Yeah.
You're just full of mocks.
Pretty much.
Awesome. Well, I also have Kyle Schatzel at the table, who's a PHP programmer from Chicago, just a few blocks from where I am here in Chicago. Welcome, Kyle. You actually used to be a big security guy, right? Hashing lots of passwords?
Yeah, something like that. I also critique and mock just in a different way. Especially get to do it today with all these guys doing the functional programming.
Nice. But your security stuff that you were doing wasn't actually specifically password hashing related, right?
No, I did AppSec, so I could definitely hash some passwords. I don't know if that's a really crappy way to say that. I can rehash passwords, dehash passwords.
Nice.
Every other figurative out there, they're all ridiculously stupid.
No, I was just referencing your security guard days. That's all.
Yes. Electronic bit security guard. Actually, I was the electronic security bit terrorist, maybe. Not necessarily the guard.
That's cool. All right, we'll get right to the topic here. Our topic is functional programming in PHP, and it's such a big topic. We kind of have to make a few definitions of some keywords and try to figure out what all this stuff means, because I have no idea what it means. So we're going to try to figure that out. Glenn, if you had to define functional programming and give a summary, what would you say functional programming is for you?
I would say for me, it's about. I'd say it's about how you consider your program flow. It's not thinking in terms of state, and instead thinking in terms of flow. And the best way that I think of it is functional programming is to imperative programming as a curve is to a derivative. And maybe that's too geeky for people.
It is for me.
But thinking in terms of, I think in terms of state, like state doesn't actually exist in real life. There's no such thing as a point on a curve. There's just too tiny. There's just you try to measure the points on a curve with calculus using two points on it, and you kind of get an approximation. And that's the same way that programs should work. If you think in terms of state and storing state, then you're ignoring the reality of what's happening. Instead, it's just a constant flow of information that's going through, and you use state to represent that constant flow of information. Does that make sense? That's not how most people would define functional programming. That's how I define it, because I think it gets much more to the core and the principles of the mathematical underpinnings of it.
Cool. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that idea of what functional programming is? Is everybody sort of on the same page, or?
That was a really interesting metaphor, which I had never heard before, but it definitely helps to hear it explained that way.
Cool. Well,
and that kind of leads into your second question, I guess, right?
Absolutely. I guess you have the show notes up. I guess. The viewers at home won't realize this, but Sammy K is a phenomenal. He had like 6 pages of notes for tonight's podcast. So this is the most well prepared. It may not show on the video, but we are adequately prepared for tonight's discussion. So, well, thanks, Jimmy. Yes.
The second question is, what is state?
Yes. Yeah. How would you define state? Because Glenn mentioned it's not about managing state. So what is state exactly?
And so, yeah, I think if you look at code examples of functional versus the way we normally write programs, there's no restrictions as a normal PHP developer. Like, I'll just create variables for stuff. And whether we have classes and things, we have members holding data. So state is just holding data around in memory and then having it available to you later. And really, if you look at a functional program where everything is basically applying itself to other functions and the results of functions, you don't have these, like, one of the first things you give up is, like, I'm not going to create variables and hold them around. And so that's definitely a form, like, state is pretty crucial to imperative programming, because you just create these variables, and that's, essentially your state. You have things that are immutable, and looks like we just lost Glenn. Saving your data around in memory, which can lead to some really lazy design, and that's what lets you write functions that are hundreds of lines long. It's kind of hard to do that in a functional program.
Right. So, and we're going to probably come back to this idea. Oh, no, we will definitely come back to this idea of what state is as defined in PHP, like assigning state to a variable and like what we can and cannot assign. But before we get to that, you mentioned mutable or immutable. does anybody, Chris, want to take this one? What is mutable and immutable? What does that mean for an object or a state?
Mutable means it can be changed, whereas immutable can't, and that's kind of the basics of it. The principle of why, though, is what I always look at, and why would you want or not want to mutate or have an immutable object, and that's it's easier to control. If something doesn't change, then you know what it's going to be. If you have an object that you pass around and you have a variable hanging on it, and that can change, every place that you pass that object to now has to worry about what the variable, what that value of that variable is at that time when it's mutable. Whereas if something's immutable, you can pass it around and not worry about it changing. And just to go back a little of how the line was a very interesting way of defining functional programming. I've never heard that before either. The way I try to describe people to associate is it's like unique piping philosophy. When you're in a prompt and you pass things to other programs with the pipe, and that's functional programming to me. You take one thing, you have an input, and it gives an output, and you pass it along to the next thing, and you just chain it along together.
So is this sort of like an anti-global scope idea? So it's just like you're only concerned with what you're given, and then you poop out something else.
Absolutely, it's definitely part of the graph solid philosophy of you have X number of inputs and one output, and there's no state and there's no change in between it.
Sweet.
It's not concerned with what the function that is given.
Right. Cool. All right. So we just got a few more terms I want to kind of go over before we start diving into some more specific functional programming and PHP stuff. Something that most, I guess, programmers will be familiar with is this idea of object-oriented programming. Kyle, I'm going to put you on the spot. What is object-oriented programming for you?
Well, I mean, I guess if you compare it to like functional programming, you have functional programming. The way that I look at it, just to kind of give you a little background, it's more like I think of it like a math function almost. Variables A, B, and C will produce output, D or whatever, and so you go step by step, and you go through the function to be able to figure out what you need at the very end. With object-oriented programming, it's got the exact difference of immutable. Everything is changing. Everything has state, right? So you come up with these ideas or abstract concepts that you might be able to, instead of just having a strict function A, B, and C, you have some type of weird object. Like right now you have when riding a car, so the car could be the object, and the car has different properties which are changeable. It might have something along the lines of wheels or steering wheel or what have you, and those things can be changed all the time. So that's kind of the state of it, being changed. And that's, I don't want to say it's most of the time, but a lot of development right now and these days revolve around object-oriented programming, including most of our MVC frameworks and things like that. So that's OOP, I guess, in a nutshell.
Cool. Also, one more I guess keyword to talk about that's sort of a new-ish feature of PHP as of 5.3, which is closures. Who wants to take on closures? Just a quick synopsis.
Yeah, I mean, closures are really cool. Closures are just anonymous functions. Really what closures come down to is it's a function that can be assigned to a variable, or, I mean, a lot of times you use it for, like, callbacks. So whenever you have something like a array map or array reduce or array walk or something like that, you can assign a function to it, and that's something that doesn't need a variable to be assigned. It doesn't need an object, and it's just kind of out there. You can do some pretty cool stuff with closures. Obviously, in the functional programming, which I'm not a great functional programmer, so I'll let these guys handle that one. But you can definitely do some pretty cool things like recursive. Now you have to kind of do a special one. You can use recursion with closures, pretty cool. Also, you can kind of use them as like lazy loaders for like a lot of objects. A lot of MVC frameworks do, or a lot of frameworks do that now. And you can. That's pretty much it. They're like a really quick, easy way to get logic into a very small piece of compact code and be able to help with just kind of containing the scope of itself. Most of the time, closures just have scope of itself or of the parent. So like you can send a variable using use from the parent to the closure function, and that's whenever the closure is declared, I think. So that's pretty cool. You can definitely get some pretty cool stuff with that.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like closures are pretty crucial to getting functional programming to work in PHP. So kind of popping onto the topic a little bit more, Chris, I guess it would be kind of helpful to look at how a typical object-oriented program would handle state versus how a functional program would handle state. And just like a quick example of something quite basic that maybe we can try to wrap our heads around. Can you think of something off the top of your head?
It's easy to describe for an object-oriented application because when you instantiate a class, so that's when you say new and a class name, that object itself is state. If you have a class A and say variable B equals new A, that object, that instance, is the state, and everything in it is a state. In pure sense of functional programming, the paradigm is you don't have state. Now, I wouldn't know how to describe how you store state in functional programming. I know there's a way, but I'm not an expert. If you like, Haskell is the most functional level programming language, but I haven't used. I've just read a bit about it. Glenn might be able to better describe that.
Yeah, I think you mentioned Haskell.
I've always used functional style programming, but it's always been in an empirical or an object-oriented programming language, and just mixing the idioms of all the languages or all the paradigms together.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting trying to do something functional style in a imperative programming language like PHP, because I think last time when we were doing a test run of the podcast, Glenn had mentioned learning Haskell because Haskell is a functional programming language, right? Like it is built from the ground up with the functional style. Is that the best way to describe it, Glenn?
Right. I believe it started as a research project. Like how do you do functional programming, pure functional programming, and still deal with the fact that you have a real world? I mean, in the real world, you have to deal with representations of reality, which is what we refer to as state. So how do you do that with functional? And with Haskell, well, there's different terms that I don't want to just throw around, but effectively this is where closures come in. You can have a subroutine or a closure, and you can store variables in that function, and then you can pass that function around just like input. And this is where the term higher order functions come in, because you can store a variable or a value in one function, and then you can store that function in another function, and store that function in another function, and you can just pass that around. And that concept is what we do all the time. As in, I say a word, and you link it to some other meaning in your head, and that word and that meaning is linked to some other meaning, and it's just this infinite level of these infinite higher order functions. And that's the way we think. That's what we do, and that's what you do with closures and passing around state in functional programming. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
I
Chris,
have
you were
a
saying
question for that. So I understand the concept you're saying, but the variable stored inside the function that gets passed around, is that function not holding its own state?
Well, it is. So the idea is, like you say, well, there's no such thing as, or you don't store state. You still have to store something, whether you call it state or not, because otherwise you have no record of what's going on. But what you do is you store state within a context, a small context, and that state doesn't change. So you can't affect other functions that are going on at the same time. And this is why functional programming is good for concurrency, because you can have a function, and you can have this function and this function, and they have their own little context of what we'll call state, and then you can do whatever you need to without affecting everything else, and you don't have to worry about like threads and different things that can get really complicated because you don't have shifting sands of values. Each value stays. The state doesn't change, but each value stays that way forever.
True that. I actually want to quickly shout out to James Mallison, who gave us a facepalm tweet about OOP being described as classes and properties. So we were. The idea is that we try not to just throw around terms just like OOP and then expect people to know what that means. But we're trying to give them keywords to kind of Google afterwards in case they don't know what it is. So the topic of the discussion really is functional style programming here in PHP and not necessarily going into depth about OOP. So I appreciate you shouting out to us. Also, I want to go ahead and move it on to this. There's a NetTuts Plus article. It's called Functional Programming in PHP by Patkos Chaba, I believe is the way you say his name. And he was describing 3 guidelines to functional programming in PHP. And here are the 3 guidelines, and we'll go over each one in a little bit more detail. So the first one is no assignments. Second is no mutable state. And the third is no while or for loops. And so for each one of those, I just wanted to kind of ask a few questions. So for the first one, no assignments. He describes we are not allowed to assign values to variables. We are, however, allowed to assign functions to variables. So here's that closure idea, assigning a function or an anonymous function to a variable. So I'm just going to throw this question out to anybody who wants to take it. Why can we not assign values to variables?
I don't agree with him. It kind of depends on what you refer to as a value. So I'm gonna drop one term because it's necessary.
Monads?
Something called referent. Sorry. There's one term called referential transparency, and what that means is you have a function or you have a value. Now, if that function returns a value, then it's the same as the value. And the fact that if they're referentially transparent, you can use them interchangeably. So what is a value? Well, if it also could be a function, then it's the same thing. So it kind of depends on how you think of value. You can say that you don't assign values, but if you assign a function that always returns a value, well, practically that's the same as a value.
Yeah, if the functions in this article are really just returning a single value and using it as a placeholder, then it's questionable. Like, what are you gaining there by using a closure? Other than you're making it indistinguishable from more complex computations.
Well, that
Oh, we're losing Glenn. He's frozen in this really cool face of about to explain something very phenomenal, but I don't think the inner tubes are going to let him do it.
You could probably dub over any answer you'd like.
Post-production editing. Glenn comes from a very interesting perspective, being a core contributor to Modulicious. He does a lot with non-blocking stuff, which is why I wanted to kind of have you guys kind of discuss the way that Modulicious does non-blocking versus something in PHP that does non-blocking like React PHP, which we're going to get to in a little bit. So I guess the idea of handling your models, like something from the database or some sort of permanent storage, is that state in a sense? If it is, I'm assuming it's just immutable, like we can't manipulate it inside of functional programming. What are your thoughts on that?
I think those things usually get a pass when you're dealing with a persistent data source. And maybe Chris or Kyle can chime in on this, but another thing I've been going over is the endless supply of object calisthenics presentations in the PHP world, of which I have one. And one of the rules there is like in structuring classes and things to keep the methods down. So few data members, either you're a collection of things or you're just coordinating two different members and the relationship in between them. So your classes don't have more than like 2 or 3 members, if that. And this really doesn't apply when you're modeling database entities, because no one is going to have database entities that are all fitting within just a handful of elements. People have much more complex data structures. So I don't think that really blends in well with. I think these are like if you look at Glenn was mentioning Haskell, and I was just Googling some stuff on the side, and there's some extensions in Haskell to like keep track of state. And if you're doing like a GUI app in Haskell, there's certain data constructs they have to allow for state things. I remember in college doing a discrete math course, and we were using Lisp, and Scheme was the dialect for all the lessons. And inside the Scheme language, there were these extensions if you wanted to do like a actual GUI application, and still for whatever reason, maybe you hate yourself, wanted to write it in Scheme, there were these extensions to have state kept track in there. So there's like writing a purely functional app, and then there's writing something usable for if you're dealing with a database with more complex models, or you're a large, like a interactive application where you have all these different events and you have to keep track of more switches and knobs. So it's, yeah, on one end, yes, Haskell, like the language, you could look at a Haskell app, and some of the contrived examples are purely functional, but a full-fledged app probably has some extensions to it. I would think. I certainly haven't dealt with enough Haskell to look.
No, I agree. I mean, to a certain extent, you kind of the database is almost like your input, or possibly the results of your output, right?
It's a form of state, even if you look at it that way.
Yeah, it is. So it's
really,
like
with really high latency.
Yeah, so like without knowing, a ton about the functional programming languages, which I don't, it kind of just makes sense, right? You have to be able to store the input and retrieve it, unless you're going to have, command line PHP running functional all the time and piping something to it. There's no other way to store it, right? So it definitely gets a pass, in my opinion.
Cool. I'm going to move on to this next point that what's his name? Pat Koschaba, I hope I'm saying that right, makes in his article about functional programming in PHP, and that is no mutable state. And we talked about this idea of mutable versus immutable, and the sort of synopsis was that mutable is something, an object, some sort of value that you can change, and immutable is something that you cannot change. And so he describes, we are not allowed to, in case of an assignment, to change the value of that assignment. We are also not allowed to change the value of any variable that has had its value set as the parameter for the current function. So no changing of parameters. So the philosophy is once set, always set, like setting a constant on the fly sort of thing. Does that even make sense?
I mean, this is one of those things that makes testing easier, I think. A good example from PHP core, I would say, would be like the datetime stuff that Derek Rethens has contributed.
Yes.
So and he actually covers this in his most recent talk on dealing with dates in PHP. They basically added, I guess in hindsight, it would have been nice if date times were these immutable objects, and if they were more integrated probably into the language. And in creating a immutable date type field, which basically doesn't have, because there's methods on datetime that let you like subtract dates or just modify the state of the datetime object, which is essentially just setting the internal member variables. And in some cases, it's a headache that you might pass a datetime instance of something, because when you're passing around variables, the functions in PHP, they're usually not passed by reference unless you opt into that, or if the function shows you that it takes things by reference. But with objects, they're always passing just kind of an alias to the object, so a function can just go and modify your object without you knowing. So to have an immutable datetime object and kind of treat it more like a value object that, in that sense, never changes like we set it once, that's the value it gets. Just like strings in PHP and primitives are basically value objects. Like when we're assigning a new string, we're concatenating to it. It's for all intents and purposes like the original memory is not getting altered in any way, where PHP is just assigning a larger concatenated string to it. So immutable objects make the application more predictable. In this case, maybe in his case, he's thinking inside the function, I don't have to track that the variable x is getting redefined to various different types multiple times, which is something PHP would happily let you do. Or in a strongly typed language, if x is defined as an integer, it's always going to be an integer. I feel like I'm putting Sammy to sleep here. I don't know.
No. I'm like I said, this is not something that that I know well, so I'm trying to wrap my mind around what that actually means in real world application. And I feel like it's almost like a philosophy of maintaining a state that exists in this moment, and not trying to maintain a state that we paint a picture for everyone else, as if it's like cross. So if I'm trying to maintain state across several different objects at once, then some other object that's trying to use that object is going to freak out because why did you change my state kind of thing. Whereas functional programming, it's only concerned within this like tiny little moment, and nothing else will freak out that you've changed its state on it. So I guess that's what it's ultimately trying to keep from happening.
Right, I think it's like if you want to change the state of this, stop using it and create a new one with a modified value.
Got it.
Which I guess could be a problem in PHP or languages where creating objects is expensive. Because certainly you look at the functional languages where creating these values, invoking closures, things like this. Like in scheme and list, there's optimizations for tail recursive functions. So basically, if you have a recursive function that returns some value and another invocation of that same function, the runtime can kind of optimize it away, and it doesn't have to have this whole stack for all the recursive values for all the function calls, because it basically knows the recursion happens at the very end, so I just have to track my previous one value that I keep adding to this. And those are things that we don't really have those optimizations in PHP. Like you can write a tail recursive function in PHP. That doesn't mean you could still get a Stack Overflow because the language is not going to optimize for it.
Stack Overflow is a great website.
Yeah, I'm just going to mark that on the. We'll count that as a pun. So we're up to number 4.
Oh, you've got a pun checklist going here.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to go over this last one, and then I think we're going to have to take a mental break and talk about something completely non-programming related. But you did mention recursion, and I think that goes right into this last guideline or criteria, is that there are no while or for loops that we can use with functional programming in PHP. He says we may, however, define our own method to cycle through the elements of a set. So that means the only way that we can cycle through a list is through recursion. And what is recursion?
Jeremy, what is recursion?
Chris, what is recursion?
Jeremy, what is recursion?
Chris, what is recursion? We're up to 5 now. So I think this goes hand in hand with the mutable state argument.
That was amazing what just happened.
We look at mutable state, and that's like the easiest example of like something I'd mutate might be like, well, for I equals, and I was actually going to ask this question, but I didn't want to get ahead of myself. So like for I equals 0, and then you iterate until the length of the list, and so you're mutating the value of I, right? And so it's convenient if we're not going to allow mutable variables that we also don't allow for loops. So this Pat goes here is a genius. But the complement of this is like, so you have a closure that Kyle was talking about earlier, and instead of iterating and defining code for the body of my closure, I'm going to, wow, Glenn is transported out of his car and into that's incredible. Sorry, I'm just awestruck by that. So in lieu of having the body of a for loop, that's an opportunity to have a function or have a closure that we execute on every element of a list, which would usually be like Kyle referred as if we were using array map in that case, or something like array reduce.
Right. That's actually used quite a lot as a classic example of when we're talking about functional programming. Yeah, totally. So I'm going to just pop off of this mental craziness real quick and just ask you, Jeremy, you've got this PHP elephant behind you that is looking really beautiful. It's the red one. Which is it? Zen? The Zen elephant?
That is the big Zen elephant. I
Nice.
usually wear it as a hat.
How did you get the Zen elephant that you wear as a hat?
In a delicious stroke of irony, the MySQL developer evangelist pulled my name out of a hat at ZenCon last year.
Oh, beautiful. I want one so badly. Chris, do you have any PHP elephants?
Yeah, I've got a couple. I've got the Arch and the PHP Women one. They're around the corner.
Oh, those sound like ones that you could just buy.
Oh, they are.
Just throw money and just get some elephants. That's all it takes now.
How does one obtain a PHP elephant?
These days, Kickstarter.
Kickstarter, yeah.
I just signed up for the Kickstarter, or back to the Kickstarter for the Laravel PHP elephant, which is an orange one. I've never seen an orange one. Or have I? I don't know. So Kickstarter's got one for a Laravel one. And Glenn, where's your PHP elephant?
I have a vomiting raptor from the Mojolicious project.
Oh,
but
what?
I don't have it with me. I don't have a PHP elephant though, unfortunately.
Did you say vomiting raptor?
Yeah, that's the in the 404 page in Mojolicious is a vomiting raptor with a unicorn. So So that's
that makes sense.
yeah, doesn't it?
We're gonna have to get a link to this. Okay, you're gonna have to post it somewhere. It's a vomiting what?
Do a search for Modulicious Fail Raptor, and you'll see. But yeah,
This is
I'll
gonna
post
be
it.
Nice.
My first elephant was actually given to me by Ornikar on Twitter, who left PHP for Scala.
Oh dear.
And so he left it behind at his old office, and he offered it to me. So that's how I got
Wow,
my.
just like erasing history there. Just
Yeah,
giving away
it's
all
like I want nothing to do with these creatures.
Aww.
You have some erotic elephant stories. It's crazy. One you get from MySQL, and another you get from the guy going to Scala. It's too good to be true.
I don't pay money for my elephants. I get them from experiences.
You earned them.
Yes.
All right, I want to pop it over to Chris. I got a big question for you, buddy. What is React PHP?
React PHP is an event-driven, non-blocking I/O library. So what that means, since I have to explain everything, is when you make a network request, in PHP, by default, everything blocks, which means it will wait for the response to come back before execution continues. So when you write a line of code that asks, let's say curl, most people are familiar with curl, say get me the contents of this website. The next line of code is do something with that content. The first line will wait for a response from the server before the next line executes. Now, what non-blocking does is that it makes the request, and it doesn't wait for a response to continue execution of the code. And that's what React is all about. The name comes from Reactor pattern, which lets multiple sources tie into the core of it, so you can do all of these asynchronous networking things at one time.
And that's a lot like the philosophy behind Node.js. In fact, on their site, they give the same exact description, event-driven non-blocking I/O. So are they essentially the same thing?
Oh my, that's a dangerous question. Yes and no. No.
I'm gonna help you out with that. I'm gonna say the principles behind it are the same.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah, that's good. Node denied event asynchronous programming. Node is just a language that fully embraces asynchronous. It does not do synchronous coding, whereas most languages that we are taught are and have since adopted asynchronous paradigms.
And so when we're talking about, go ahead.
Like to do this asynchronous stuff in PHP. Chris and Igor basically had to. The original implementation was write a software event loop to keep track of all the I/O streams and the callbacks and ticks and things, the functions that we want to execute regularly, and basically make the event loop. Or you use some like libev C extension that's and use that event loop. But there's basically that has to be added to PHP. Whereas with Node, it's like the language is itself, the runtime is an event loop, and so every library that exists for Node, everything has to do all of the I/O through that one loop. There's no risk that you're going to call blocking unless it's a computational thing. Any I/O is not going to be blocking if you're doing it inside Node's event loop.
It's interesting you brought up a couple of keywords I was wanting to hit up on. We were talking about non-blocking I/O or non-blocking input-output. What is the difference between that and multi-threading?
I'm going to defer to Kyle because Kyle said he was going to ask me this question earlier.
So can I ask you the question again?
No, you can answer the question.
I'm interested in your response, though. It's interesting.
I think the question earlier was why would you? We were talking about pthreads, which is one of, I guess there's maybe a couple of them, PHP extension that in this case implements POSIX threads in PHP. And so in that case with pthreads, you basically have separate functions, I guess, unless you register runnable classes like Java. That's a question, Kyle.
I heard part of that. What did you say?
The pthreads, when you're running pthreads in PHP, are you just registering functions, or are you registering like a runnable class? I'm not familiar with the interface where you dispatch a new thread.
I'm probably the most. I'm not going to be efficient in this question. Most of the p threads are exactly lined. Most of the p thread functions are exactly lined up with the c functions.
Okay.
So it's going
They're
to
probably just dispatching a function.
Yeah, you also have go ahead. That's the basics of it though. They're almost completely aligned.
So in a p thread, if you want to do multiplexed I/O in a p thread, or using p threads, basically keep your single. It's like if you run a shell script and you want to run curl 6 times, right? You'll probably just run curl and then background process it, and just to let the operating system deal with running them all concurrently, and scheduling between them. So there really doesn't have to be an event loop because you're not in a single thread of execution where you have to share you can only run one computational thing at a time. So and that's why in a single-threaded environment, like Node is single-threaded, and yet they can still scale up to however many thousand requests or beyond, just because so much of the time is spent waiting on the actual I/O to come back. And so when the I/O is ready, then we'll dispatch something, and hopefully it's a small function to go and like answer the HTTP request or take the message or write it back to the database or something. But if you're dealing with threading, I don't think there's much thought put into dealing with event loops or anything like that. I'm sure there's frameworks. There's probably threaded event loop frameworks.
So it approaches this idea of non-blocking a little differently, essentially, without an event loop. P-threads.
Yeah, I'd say it's more the brute force PHP double-ended hammer approach. I'll just create more. I'll just fork a PHP process or just create another thread and not care about blocking, because now my thread blocks I don't have to care about disrupting anything else in the program. Chris has a point on this. I'll defer.
I just want to point out that asynchronous is about evented I/O, and that your script continues running on while the network I/O is happening. While threads, while they can do this in the way Jeremy said, and that multiple of them can do multiple requests and block on different threads, threading is about parallel execution, whereas asynchronous is about offsetting network requests. So threading can be used for so much more than just as a way to make network requests. It's a way to do parallel computation.
Yeah, and anytime you're using a non-blocking framework or anything like that, you can still block if you
Absolutely,
want.
yeah. There's the excellent Fibonacci Node.js example where someone implemented Fibonacci in Node.js and it just ran very, very slowly. Just because it was bound on computation, not network communication.
Exposing the weaknesses, my favorite. On both React PHP and Node.js sites, the typical example that they give for this awesome non-blocking event-driven awesomeness is a web server. But most PHP devs never need to write a web server. I mean, you got Apache, you got Nix, whatever. What do you call Nix?
Nginx.
Nginx.
Yeah.
Only seen it ever written. I'm just kidding. What are some practical examples of React PHP that a typical PHP programmer might use?
The last thing someone should use React for is a web server, actually. I don't know why we still have that example as our...
What's the hello world? It's the hello world of async.
Yeah, pretty much. Good practical uses. I think the most we're seeing people do now is as a client, like they're using non-blocking as a web scraper, is what I've seen a lot of. Little self-indulging here, but as a WebSocket server. And we have a couple other non-blocking servers that are non-web, but for other purposes. Like we believe we have a Stomp, but at a lower level, everything just devolves down to a client and a server, and which side you want to use that on, and with which protocol. HTTP is just a protocol, and that's what most, like Jeremy said, it's the hello world kind of thing. Every PHP developer has probably started doing a website, so that's kind of what we familiarize people with.
And it'd be good to mention Stephen. So Stephen Rhodes was at DrupalCamp LA this weekend, and every time someone makes a new React presentation, it's like, oh, that's amazing. So he presented. It was either probably sometime over the weekend, and he was showing us the demos from last week, and one of them was a game server. I think most of his examples were using it for HTML5 event polling. Chris can correct me here. And similar to like Chris's Ratchet WebSocket server. So yes, it's like you're serving web requests, but you're not trying to pretend to be Apache or Nginx in this respect.
I think the most important thing I've seen someone do with React is they flew a drone. That's just awesome.
Yeah, there's the AR drone interface.
That's what I typically get asked to do on a day when a client comes in. They want me to fly their drones with PHP. So
with PHP, exactly.
No, that's really great. React PHP, it uses an event loop, right, to handle all of this crazy non-blocking stuff, correct?
Yep.
Cool.
That is the core of React, and that's where the name comes from. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, this could be used in a long-running process from the command line for, doing whatever from the command line. Lots of people have said that PHP is not a good language to use for long-running processes.
Cal said that last week on your podcast.
Yeah. So is that still true, or what's the consensus, the latest and greatest of PHP?
That hasn't been true for 10 years. PHP is also a bad object-oriented language as of PHP 5.3, or I mean PHP 3. 5.3 introduced garbage collection, and 2 resolved circular dependencies, and 5.3 had garbage collection, I think. I forget the exact things, but it's been capable of doing long-running processes for many, many years now, and has become quite good at it.
So
that said, it's still possible to get memory leaks, especially if you're using Doctrine.
So it's not necessarily PHP itself, but just the programs that you're using will have the leaks on it. Are there examples of where PHP would be a bad choice for a long-running process? That you could write would be better to use like Python or Ruby or something like that, or Perl. Maybe this is a Glenn question. Glenn's going to say always use Perl, right?
No, but this is a PHP podcast, so I don't want to say anything.
I would say there's probably
awesome.
There's async Perl frameworks. So there's tools in every language. Among the dynamic languages, maybe Python has the most mature because it has Tornado. They have and other terms like to loop into that. They have like greenlets. They have ways of writing asynchronous coroutines. And then Kyle was talking about working with Go, which is not asynchronous, but they have a very nice model
I would say like.
Go ahead, Glenn. I think his inner tubes is cutting out again.
Oh no.
Oh, okay. I wouldn't say there's any. I mean, anything that you say is bad is just subjective. There's really no. Whatever works for you, you go ahead and use it. Any single-threaded language these days is going to have some sort of non-blocking framework because at base it's just an event loop. I mean, the only one I've seen with PHP is React PHP. Modulicious or Perl has a couple. Modulicious is one of them that has the event loop and the non-blocking framework, and then a web framework built on top of that. I mean, you can use whatever you want. It really comes down to if you can get the job done with that tool.
I was going to actually ask you about how Modulicious handles the non-blocking stuff in the event loop. And it would be kind of cool to see how it might differ from React.
That's the answer right there.
Well, I guess the question was: is there like a pure software?
Modulicious is a little bit more. It's a little bit.
I think there's like a 10-second delay going all the way out to Utah.
It's totally asynchronous.
We should have multi-threaded Google Hangouts going on here.
So I guess one question I have for Glenn is if do you have like multiple event loop implementations? Because I know there's probably like a lib event binding for Perl and a libev binding just because it's so easy to have just bindings to C libraries. So are there multiple? And there's probably you have like the select function, so you can multiple ways to implement your own event loop or use an extension. Question mark.
Yeah, I mean, you can use select if you want to go that low. You can use select if you want to go that low level, and then there's several non-blocking frameworks for Perl. What I specialize in is Modulicious, which is a non-blocking framework that's built upon the lower level non-blocking frameworks. And there are libev bindings that you can do. You can make use of that to do things like 10,000 processes or 10,000 operations at one time, stuff like that. But effectively, to answer Sammy's question, it's all an event loop at the base, because these are all single-threaded languages we're talking about. So effectively, you can only do one thing at a time, but with the event loops, it gives the appearance of doing multiple things at one time.
We can describe the event loop. So I have an idea what the event loop is in my head on actually how I would maybe possibly try to build one, but describe in more detail what an event loop is and how is it threaded, but we're sitting here talking that it's also asynchronous.
Well, it's not threaded.
It's a single thread, but we're also talking about asynchronous. So how does that event loop work?
So at the core of it, I think, is what it comes down to if you're writing. So supposing you're not using a C library, which is like the event loop written in C, and let's say you're doing like a pure language implementation. So there's different ways to. Some of the function names are select or pull or kpull, and these are just functions, ultimately C functions, that let us we'll pass in a bunch of sockets or file descriptors or just things that we want to check, and the function will then come back and block for as long as we tell it to, or maybe just instantaneously pull them if we don't want to wait at all. And we just tell us which ones have stuff to read, which ones we can write to, and which ones maybe have errors because they got closed or terminated. And so at its heart, it's pulling a whole bunch of streams or file descriptors or sockets at once, and then getting the kind of a view of their state. And then from that point, we can know, oh, this socket's ready for reading, and you registered a callback to be invoked when there's data available to be read. So now the next part of my loop is after I do that polling, I will go then dispatch to whoever's listening on that particular socket. And so different, like when we talk about like Node.js serving hundreds of thousands of requests a second, that's how many like sockets that they're tracking at once. And so that's definitely a issue, because there's limits, I think, in various polling implementations of how many resources you can examine at one time. So maybe things have to be batched up. I don't know if the other guys have. Definitely, this might be a limitation with like the pure PHP event loop for React versus libevent and libev. Maybe they handle this differently.
I know the pure PHP one, which the select I think is limited to 1024. But once you install libev or libevent, it comes down to hardware. Any language, whether it's PHP, Python, Ruby, Node, whatever, it's going to cop out eventually on the hardware limitation. PHP might go out a bit sooner because it's a little heavier on the user land stuff, but we've had people report thousands upon thousands of concurrent connections without any issue so far.
Would it be kind of fair to say that an event loop is basically just almost like a while loop that takes the status of each individual either file descriptor or socket, and then will run code almost like a hook, or like you said, a callback at a specific point in time? Is that kind of fair to say what an event loop is?
Yeah, I'd say there's actually probably three while loops. So you do the event loop, you do the polling, and then you iterate over the ones that are ready to be read, and then you do the same for the ones that are writable, and then the ones that have error conditions. Can
you describe polling for me?
So the poll function, and I guess I'll approach this from React's case. So again, there's several actual C functions available with different implementations. There's poll, kpull, and select, and they basically have around the same interface. You pass in a bunch of file descriptors, and by the time it returns to you, the collections you passed in. So in PHP's case, I think you give a reference to an array of file descriptors, and by the time the function returns, the readable ones you sent in are kind of filtered down to the ones that are actually able to be read, and so that's what you iterate over. So you're giving in a bunch of stream sockets, file descriptors, all synonyms in this case, of what I want to read, things I'm considering for reading, writing, and checking for errors, and then also a timeout value. And the timeout is important because that, if we're doing an event programming, right, typically the concept of the event loop is basically as long as we have these I/O streams that we're interacting with, we're gonna, and if there's no other inputs, I'm not running there's not a callback that I want to run every 1 second that maybe does like debugging stats or something like that. I'll basically block until there's some readable, writable, or error event. So in that case, my timeout might be unlimited. My program is going to essentially sleep until there's some I/O activity for me. But in the event loop case, you might have functions that you want to run regularly, or you might have said, there's a function I'd like to run 3 seconds from now. So now when I'm blocking on I/O, I'm going to basically wait until there's an I/O event, or I'll wait up to 3 seconds because I know there's something else that I need to run anyway. So that's the general logic of the event loop is I'll wait a limited amount of time if I'm just dependent on the I/O. Otherwise, I'll wait until I know there's something that I need to do a few seconds from now. I think most of the frameworks cases, you have the ability to have a deferred function I'd like to run a few seconds from now, or have a periodic function. In React's case, there's also the concept of a tick, which is like every time the event loop goes through, I'd like to run something.
Is that tick similar to the tick that you can find in PHP using like process control functions?
No, it is not like it's not like PHP's declare tick, which actually runs every time a PHP opcode is executed.
So a tick in this case would be maybe the
really just
iteration of the event loop.
Yes, well, each poll is a tick essentially. And Stephen Rhodes in IRC is clarifying epoll is the Linux equivalent, KQ is the version on BSD. So there's they all have similar interfaces, but they're kind of operating system dependent.
Yes, the way the select works to see what's busy, it talks to the kernel, and the kernel will say what's available, or the system will check it itself. So epoll and the KQ are the newer, more efficient ways that the event loop will wait for the kernel to tell it what has changed. Rather, with the traditional select, it goes and checks it all itself. It's not very performant. And this is why we always encourage people to install libevent or libev when they're using React, so that it's more performant, can handle a higher number of concurrent connections.
When you're using React for your serious business.
Yeah.
What do you use React for, you guys? Just throwing that out there.
I don't know. Does Chris want to do this first, or I have a somewhat interesting anecdote story.
Oh, you go.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I worked on I was not using it for I/O at all, for network I/O. I was originally using it for communicating with child processes because I wanted to fork a process and then control it from a PHP script. And we had a pretty kludgy way of dealing with this for the Mongo driver test suite. Because we use the Mongo shell, which is basically a REPL, a JavaScript REPL, and that already had facilities to launch a cluster of servers for our test suite. And I basically wanted to interact with this in PHP. And so a coworker, Hannes, had wrote a pretty messy collection of PHP that they totally worked. And I was thinking like, oh, well, React, everything in React right now is for network I/O. When we fork a process in PHP, we get the standard in, standard out, standard error as streams, file descriptors. So why not try and make that work with React? And there was actually already a pull request. I kind of commandeered that and finished it up, and that became the child process component, which was pretty interesting. Still maintain it's probably a contrived example.
For testing the MongoDB driver, basically, right?
Yes. Yeah, the MongoDB PHP driver, of all things. So.
Nice.
I honestly, I would think like a WebSocket server is probably one of the more reasonable things to do with it. And that usually, Glenn was mentioning earlier that there's solutions in every language. So when it comes down to, well, why, even just earlier I tweeted something and someone suggested Meteor.js for async development. When I was tweeting out Stephen Rhodes' React slides, and because doing async programming in PHP seems ridiculous. But if you already have an application and a bunch of existing code that you could leverage with an async framework, so like other non-blocking code, it's beneficial to use something in your language, and then you're much more easier to plug in the stuff instead of like, oh, I'm going to re-implement everything in Node.js, all my data model and everything else I'm working with. And I think there's things in various state of usability for like communicating with MySQL and React. I made a proof of concept Mongo driver with it, which is a really horrible API around it right now. But there's like certainly for things like the inter-process communication and the messaging. Chris can chime in here. The different things that integrate like 0MQ in your React app, because those are, if you're dealing with an async framework, instead of actually talking to the database, you probably just would rather work with a messaging server. And so those have existed for a long time. They're much more mature than the MySQL or the like Mongo integration for React. And so those are the fact that those are the things that exist and not the actual database drivers kind of clues you into what are probably the reasonable things to do with React.
Much like Python a few years ago, Python was a blocking language until Twisted and I forget what the other one's called.
Tornado. Yep.
Were created, and they had to rewrite every database driver and everything to be asynchronous. And we're not quite as mature as that project is right now, and some people are nice and starting to work with it. I think ideally would be to have, and this won't happen for years maybe, is the core drivers, like the core PHP or the core MySQL driver, for example, not matter if it's synchronous or asynchronous, and then it can be implemented in either paradigm. That would be, a perfect case scenario.
I think a huge thing is because the actual, I think it's the MySQL native driver has a way to do async queries, or you just dispatch queries and get an async handle, but it's the fact that it doesn't use any common event loop. And
it runs its own event loop without
right.
exposing the socket, so it's...
Right. It's not like it might as well be its own thing, and you really can't integrate it. The same thing with like doing multiple requests in curl. Even if that's using its own async thing underneath, it's not going to play nice with your existing event loop, and we don't have interfaces and stuff that other things are going to depend on.
Now, what's been really nice is with PHP 5.6, the Postgres has had some changes to it, and Postgres can be run asynchronously now. They also expose the socket file descriptor, so we can take that, tie it into our event loop,
listen
and
on
do
it.
purely asynchronous Postgres now as of 5.6.
To tie into all that stuff?
Actually, yeah, you could. The developer, Daniel Lowry, is that?
RD Lowry?
Yes.
Okay.
So he's the fellow who did the asynchronous Postgres stuff in 5.6, and he gave me some ideas and some code. He said with Postgres, his proof of concept was that he tied it into the event loop, and when there were changes to the database, pushed it to the event loop, which then pushed it out to Ratchet. So as changes were coming into your database, you were seeing them live on your website through.
It's basically Meteor.js with Postgres and PHP instead of JavaScript.
Nice.
So that is pretty interesting. If all it takes is exposing a socket, I could totally see that happening with the Mongo driver.
Inspiration. It's happening right now.
Yeah, I would totally look into that. Just have to convince Derek and Hannes that this is a worthwhile.
True. Well, to kind of bring this thing full circle, how can we combine this idea of functional programming in PHP with React PHP? Are these things totally different? Did I just screw up trying to merge these things? Are we talking about two totally different subjects here?
I think the way you write callbacks, there's definitely overlap there, because you don't end up having much global state in React. Like a lot of, when speaking some of the examples, like you might keep track of this active connections globally. That's what a lot of the demos have, like when you do the TCP chat server. But in a lot of your function, like you're working with small closures that execute on results, and even when you're dealing with promises, which is an alternative to having nested callbacks for things, you're basically processing and then emitting a subsequent result, which may be asynchronous, in piecemeal. And so you're breaking up what would be a large imperative program into small executable chunks that all happen to depend on different asynchronous things. I wouldn't say there's full overlap, but there's definitely the concepts of the way the things that you shouldn't be doing in a in a functional programmer, the things that are not allowed are probably also like best practices for writing asynchronous programs, like avoiding that big computation, dividing your computations up into small chunks.
A lot of the executional work you can do in React would be good as functional. The way I see functional is, the way I see PHP is PHP encompasses, it's a pirate language. It steals everything from everyone else, and I think that's wonderful. It has object-oriented, it deals with state. When you're talking React and TCP, TCP is a stateful protocol. You have connections open, you deal with a pool of connections, so you have to have some state. But PHP also can be used in a functional paradigm. And I see when you do your computation and processing, using that in a functional style on the interfacing with React is a good paradigm to use. And it makes your code more defensive, and it makes it your input and output more reliable using it in a functional style.
So it's basically a way of avoiding callback hell.
I would say, I mean, promises are really a way of avoiding callback hell. I mean, it's.
I would disagree with that. I think the point of promises is to construct flow and handle errors, whereas callbacks don't have a good way to handle errors. I think reducing callback hell with promises is more of a good side effect, but not the purpose of promises.
Cool. Well, I think my mind's officially exploded all over the place on the inside there. You guys are just really awesome at explaining all this stuff, and I'm actually going to be diving deeper into this and trying to implement some functional stuff in my own apps, including React PHP and stuff like that. So
I would throw out two things.
Yes.
One is Igor Wheeler's GitHub profile, obviously, because you will see every functional use of PHP there. And then also someone asked you on Twitter this week why Larry Garfield wasn't in this. He has a pretty good presentation on functional programming in PHP.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which I think he's given it at Sunshine PHP before, and probably a few other conferences. So Larry is one of the foremost Drupal evangelists and kind of responsible for getting Drupal and Symfony to play nice together.
I think he's from Chicago.
Yeah, he is. He does work in Chicago. I don't know if he's coming to WorstCon though. I have to hassle him on that.
That's the second time he was mentioned in the first one too. So we definitely got to get him on here.
Yeah. So definitely, I definitely pull up his slides. He has a really good talk where he just using normal PHP with array map functions and the basic stuff to introduce the basics of functional programming with PHP.
Sweet.
So that's really cool before you get into Igor stuff and just start feeling completely overwhelmed.
I'm feeling completely overwhelmed at the moment. It's good though. Anything new is good. I'm always learning. That's my motto. Sort of wrapping it up a little bit, I wanted to kind of quickly go over something that I wanted to close with every podcast, and that is something old, something new, something borrowed, and something deprecated. So from all you guys, what is something that's been around in PHP that's still awesome?
I would throw out there all of the low-level C bindings for these the fact that we have access to select and things like that. And maybe it was mentioned last week, but the streams has been there probably since PHP 4, but there's still learning creative uses for them.
Yeah, Davey, I think, or Cal mentioned that streams is awesome.
They were expounding about how I think it was actually Davey. We were saying these other languages have similar functionalities, but the PHP streams allow you to do so much with. I probably shouldn't have watched last week's episode because I'm just repeating it. But
they're still awesome.
The fact that you can make React. And a lot of this stuff, aside from the closures and things, really just has been there, just sitting under our noses. And it wasn't until Rasmus and Igor just had a random idea. It was oh, okay, I'll try and make this tonight.
Sort of like the socket stuff for MongoDB, which is going to happen later tonight, right?
Yeah. I'm already working on it.
Nice. What about something brand new in PHP or something that's coming soon that we can expect? That's awesome.
Just to me, but
no, it's for everybody.
Okay. Is anyone else excited about yield statements and And this is not even new ananymore. It's like
Generators, yeah.
5.5 is so old. I'm waiting for someone else to contribute that to React so I can use it. Because it seems like it would be a great idea. Basically, everything on Nikita Popov's blog is outstanding.
Yeah, cooperative multitasking. I think Jeremy just volunteered.
Yeah, So Nikita is. I don't think anyone's ever actually seen him in person. He might be a actual organization of people, but he just blogs about a lot of the interesting cutting edge stuff on because he's a PHP contributor. But he has an excellent blog article on kind of using generators and yield statements in PHP to do cooperative multitasking. So it'd be really easy to Google up by that.
Sweet.
I think the new stuff in PHP is there. It's just it's kind of difficult to write a library that depends on 5.6 and expect enough people to use it. And definitely for frameworks, right? So I think React now depends on 5.4, but you have a lot of the largest frameworks are still 5.3. And there's stuff like Doctrine that I contribute on. Like I'd like to use traits and things, but it's hard to bump a dependency like that.
But traits came out in 5.4 and 5.3 just got deprecated officially, right? Like end of life state.
Yeah, but WordPress still has to support 5.2, so.
Oh, boo! I didn't know about that.
No, but it's. I this is around the time where you can assume that most people pulling in stuff with Composer packages are comfortable with 5.3 and above because Composer needs it. But as far as it shouldn't stop anyone from writing this stuff. Like that's what I definitely appreciate about a lot of the projects that Igor.
Definitely. So what about something borrowed? Is there something that PHP has borrowed from another language, or you've seen other languages borrow from PHP?
React. I'm going to refuse to answer this question. I'm just going to somebody else chime in here.
I think PHP steals everything from every language. That's one of the things that makes it great. It does. No, like
Glenn is the biggest smile in his face right now.
Generators came from Python, namespaces, and the object-oriented movement, as much as I'm going to get flamed for this, Java. There's a great article, I forget who wrote it. It's called PHP is a Pirate's Language. I highly recommend reading that.
Cool. It's like the history of how PHP has stolen everything from everybody else.
Yeah, exactly, and how we should celebrate that and embrace it. And we get the best things from other languages. It's wonderful.
We just happened to get them 20 years later, right?
After they've been perfected.
After they've been perfected. That's the most optimistic
view. We wait until everybody else screws it up, and then we come in and steal it the last second.
Yeah, but really, if you research stuff from the 60s, there's nothing new in programming. Any language. What Go is doing, that stuff has all been done before. It's cool, but it's nothing new. It's just a new perspective for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked about that a little bit last week, where there's been a concept that's been around for 20 years, and then all of a sudden it's the new hotness this week, just called something else. Actually, Glenn, you mentioned last time that Perl actually invented package management, right? C-SPAN or CPAN? CPAN.
It was definitely the precursor for pretty much everything, and everybody copied them. That's why I chose Perl in the beginning, because it had CPAN and it was amazing. But to counter what I forgot who was saying it, but I'd say almost everything is completely old. Like everything, Common Lisp pretty much did everything, but Haskell is actually something that's doing something new. But other than Haskell, everything is completely old. Is
Erlang before Haskell? Because Erlang's also a functional programming language, right?
Oh, definitely. If you use Erlang is it feels like it was designed by a telecom company in the 80s, because it was.
Yes. Glenn sounds like an angry math professor here, yelling at us about Haskell.
Well, wasn't Haskell created around the same time? 20 years ago?
I'm a total Haskell fanboy, there's no question.
Cool.
This seems like something we should be able to Google.
Indeed, everything's just a Google away. Lastly, what is something that's deprecated in the language or the community in PHP that we are just going to no longer see popping around? Pair.
That's true. Not actually deprecated, but might as well be.
What about?
I heard that as hair, and I almost laughed because it's true.
So this puts us in an interesting situation because the PHP extensions are currently very dependent on PECL, which is essentially pair. And,
what is the difference, by the way?
Just basically different. The main protocols and the way you outline dependencies and stuff, I think, are very similar. And that's why if you run the command line tools, they basically have the same options and the same bad option parsing syntax, which requires like the flags to be before the package name and stuff like that.
Oh dear.
But so Composer is going in a direction, and I heard this talked about at a HHVM conference, where possibly for HHVM dependencies they'd like to use Composer for stuff. And I know Pierre from Microsoft is working with Niels to kind of get a way to compile PHP extensions without going through PECL, just so they can be more easily installed, especially on non-Linux platforms, which is kind of a chore. So I see a point down the line where we might be able to get rid of PECL, or PECL would change, because it's pair is kind of I think with PHP Unit moving off of pair, that was kind of the big thing in the bucket. There's still a lot of pair packages out there, but that was probably the largest domino to fall.
I will not be sad to see it go.
Composer is probably one of the other great things that we could say was borrowed from another language, because definitely there was a lot of that based on, and some of the feedback of people that have worked with multiple package managers and have said, oh, how nice Composer is compared to some other projects. So basically it was one of the most recent ones implemented, and Jordy and Niels were able to pluck the good things about NPM and Gem and these other things, and not take the headaches from them. So not to say that's perfect, but it's definitely, we've benefited from going so long in the dark ages that now we have a feather in our cap.
I have to echo what Jeremy says. I have to use, I think, 5 or 6 different package managers for different languages in my day job. And Composer is, yeah.
Yum.
CocoaPods, like many different. Pip's good. I like Pip, but Composer is just, in my opinion, and it is just an opinion, the best of them. And I got the pleasure of talking to Niels when I was in Montreal, and I was like, you guys did such a fantastic job. And he said, well, we saw everything Maven and what all the other ones did wrong. He said, we took the good things and tried to do the best job. And I was like, wow, you're exactly right. So why did this one fail? And he goes, I don't know. The one that came after that. The new thing in JavaScript, it seems to make a package manager. There's a new one every day.
The problem with the new JavaScript package managers is they try and distribute them through NPM. Sorry, I wasn't being serious, but I'm just going to count that as another pun.
That's 6.
It's weird. I was looking at my pun counter, and we're a little late.
I love it. Pablito from Twitter just said that there's an interesting project based on CKAN, or CKAN. Yeah, built on Drupal. And he recommends checking it out. It's on Twitter, it's at getdkan. Do any of you guys know what he's talking about? I have no idea what that is.
You're saying it's based on CKAN?
He says it's an interesting project based on CKAN, but built on Drupal. I'm assuming it's it says it's the Drupal Open Data Platform is the TLDR version on Twitter.
So I'm just
assuming it's functional. Yeah. DKAN is a Drupal-based open data platform.
DKAN.
With a full suite of cataloging, publishing, and visualization features that allows for governments, nonprofits, and universities to easily publish data to the public.
Oh, so this is like a package repository for like open data. I would guess.
I guess functionally programmed, I guess, or just random shout out. Either way, you got a free promo there.
Mission accomplished.
Yes. Speaking of free promos, we're just going to wrap things up, and I want to give all you guys just an opportunity to do a shameless plug. Jeremy, I'm going to put you on the spot. We'll start with you. Do you have a shameless plug you want to close out with?
So I don't know what everyone else is doing on Saturday, September 20th, but I'm going to be in Chicago, or driving to Chicago, or in a hospital in Ohio because we had a car accident, on my way to get sausages with a bunch of other PHP lads and lasses for WorstCon. That's WURSTCON.com. Please visit that so I don't feel so bad for blowing $10.60 on a domain name, which will soon be expired. And if this is a success, I could promise we will have an international WorstCon next year, most likely in Krakow and Berlin. So, big announcement there.
Nice. I'm totally there, dude. I mean, do you guys
Yeah,
are
I
all
want to
like?
thank you. Sammy's been an amazing help with some of the logistical planning. He's been an excellent co-events coordinator. I'm totally talking about this as if it's a more serious planned conference than it actually is. And I even heard Kyle is going to be there as well because I made him a logo for his meetup group.
Oh yeah, and
I'd like
that's
to thank Chicago PHP for sponsoring. They didn't actually approve anything. I just decided to list them on the website. So it's been a wonderful relationship.
Yeah, it was approved before. Trust me.
And I'm trying
Anything
to
I got was approved.
we're trying to get Server Grove as a lanyard sponsor. I'm still waiting to hear back from Pablo.
well, there's going to be drinks at my place. Hopefully, we can pregame before going to like a Cubs game or something like that. Or if you guys just want to, you guys are welcome to crash my place if you need to just sleep on the floor. We'll get some blow up mattresses and stuff. It'll be fun. Do like slumber party at my place.
We should do a live roundtable.
Dude, I'm down. Let's do it.
With an actual roundtable.
With an actual roundtable. I've got a square one, so we'll fake
No one
it.
has to know. To keep the camera aimed up high.
True. Chris, you got anything you want to shamelessly plug?
Sure. React, Ratchet, use them, contribute, please.
Speaking of that, there's a guy, Steve Rhodes, who just posted on Twitter an example of MMO/chat built on React PHP and Ratchet.
Yes, his was the presentation I was referring to earlier. That was the one in the same Steve Rhodes, because there's actually a lot of them. It's very complicated.
So go to the link right now. It's a multiplayer game. You will all play together. I'll do a shout out to Steve though. He's been contributing to React lately, and just want to thank him for his contributions. They've been a great help.
I'm doing it right now. I'm playing. I just said this is Sammy.
So you can use your arrow keys.
Ooh, I have a little guy in there. He's got horns. This is a neat little, and this is built on React. And, dude, everybody needs to do React.
This is actually one of the more significant professional things you can do with React.
There's like 4 or 5 people in here right now just moving their little avatars around. That's great. All right. And Glenn, where did Glenn go? Oh, we lost Glenn. I was going to give him a time to promote something, but he's a core contributor to Mojalicious. So if you guys get an opportunity to check out Mojalicious, if you're frustrated with PHP and you're like, oh, screw it, I'm moving to another language, Perl might be your calling. And if you have any questions, you could just hit him up on Twitter. I think it's at Timpire, Tempir, Tier. But no, I have no idea what his Twitter handle is. We're moving on to Kyle. Do you have anything to shamelessly plug?
As always, the Chicago PHP user group. Also going to plug WorstCon. I will be there. I will be drinking. I probably will not be sober for most of the time, but that's my plan. Also, I completely destroyed pthread, so I'm sure I'm going to Twitter yell at that one later. Maybe that's our next thing. Someone who can speak more to pthreads than we can, or at least I can, because I've only used it in very small things. So.
Pthreads is, of course, short for pun threads, and
yeah.
I'm sure you're going to relish WorstCon.
Pun number 7. This is awesome.
Oh, this is horrible.
I don't know if anyone else got the vibe from Glenn's seating position. I kind of thought he was using WebTV to chat with us.
Might have. He's got an interesting setup. I like that guy.
His car turned into a bed. I haven't had one of those beds since I was 6 years old.
A big car bed. Love it. All right, so guys, thanks so much for being on. Our next episode is we're going to be talking about APIs and PHP with Jeremy Lindblom, Matt Frost, and I'm trying to get Phil Sturgeon on this bad boy because he's like the API guy. I sent him a tweet.
Keep your finger on the censor button.
What's that?
Keep your finger on the censor button.
On the censor button. I know it'll be a
wild
podcast that I have to mark as explicit so far, probably.
He might demand to be the host. I don't know if he does guest.
That would be totally fine. He's got that cool British accent. That would be excellent. So we're actually going to be asking some questions about like are modern web apps moving all their domain logic into the client side, like in JavaScript, and all we need in the back end is some API, and we're running that with PHP or something. And we're also going to look at some modern API thingies that the latest and greatest 2.0 Twittery thingy. That's the best way that I can describe it at the moment. If there's something you'd like to share about APIs, if you feel like you're an expert, you need to be on the panel for next week's episode. So just hit me up on Twitter if you're interested. My handle is @SammyK. or just Sammy K. The @ I guess everybody assumes it's Twitter, right? Thank you, Jeremy, Chris, Glenn, Kyle, for joining in for this discussion, and we will see you guys next episode.
Thanks, Sammy. Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
Cheers.